The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our live chat. I'm Lakelyn Hogan, gerontologist and caregiver advocate with Home Instead Senior Care. Again, thank you so much for tuning in today. We have a great topic, strategies to cope with ambiguous loss. And our live chats are brought to you by Home Instead Senior Care, a network of locally owned franchise offices. The Home Instead Senior Care Network offers in-home care with an individualized approach to helping keep your older adult loved ones safe and independent at home. And to learn more, you can visit homeinstead.com. But before we dive into today's live chat, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to go over. First and foremost, we have muted all of our lines so that you can go about your day. It'll help reduce the background noise for everyone. We want you to be able to grab the doorbell if somebody drops by, do the dishes, fold laundry, whatever you need to do while you listen to today's chat. Don't worry, we cannot hear you on our end. I also want to encourage all of you that are listening to type in any questions that you have. We have a great expert with us today. We're happy to answer questions. That's why we have these live chats. So at any time, if you think of a question, there's no such thing as a silly question. Please feel free to type it in because it's very likely that somebody else on the call has a similar question, or the question you ask will help somebody else on the line. And then you don't have to worry about taking notes because we do record today's webinar, and we'll email you a link to the recording at the conclusion of the webinar. So if you find this chat to be helpful, or you think, wow, my neighbor or friend or family member would love to listen to this, you can forward that link on. You can share it on social media, whatever you want to do with the link. Feel free to do that because we are recording. So that covers all of our housekeeping items. So let's go ahead and dive into today's topic. We'll be talking about, again, strategies to cope with ambiguous loss. When I talk to family caregivers who are caring for someone with Alzheimer's or another type of dementia, I often hear them say things such as, "She's no longer the mother I grew up with," or "I know he's still here, but he's no longer the man I married." And it's really heartbreaking to hear family members describe how they're watching their loved ones slip away right before their eyes. And many also describe this as an ongoing grieving process. They feel that every day they're watching their loved ones slip away and feel themselves going through these different stages of grief, or kind of an ongoing grieving process. And these stories truly are heartbreaking when I hear them, and it wasn't until recently that I learned about this term, ambiguous loss, which really put some context to these feelings that many of these family caregivers are experiencing, and lets them know that this is normal. You're not the only one going through this. And so if you subscribe to our Caring Connections email list, you might remember us sending out a wonderful webinar by Susy Favaro on ambiguous loss. And we had such a fantastic response to that email that we decided to bring her on live for today's chat. So we're very honored to have Susy with us to dive deeper into this topic and talk with us about strategies to cope with this ambiguous loss. And just to give you some more information on Susy, she is a licensed clinical social worker in the Memory Disorder Clinic at Banner's Alzheimer's Institute, providing counseling, referral, educational, and support services to meet client and caregiver needs. Most recently, she developed a programming on ambiguous loss. She has worked in the field of gerontology for over 40 years, so she has a wealth of knowledge. The focus of her work has been in the implementation and training of evidence-based programs in self-management of chronic conditions for older adults and unpaid family caregivers. Her programs include Enhanced Wellness, Powerful Tools for Caregivers, Chronic Disease Self-Management Programs, Pearls, a depression intervention, and Active Choices. And in 1997, she joined the training faculty of Status One Health System in Boston as a trainer in motivational interviewing and behavior change theory. And in 2005, she became a Pearls trainer. So Susy has such a wealth of knowledge, such a wealth of experience, and we are so excited to have her with us today to talk about ambiguous loss. So welcome, Susy.
Well, thank you for having me. This is my favorite topic, so I'm pleased to be here.
Oh, we're so pleased to have you. So to get us started, I thought, would you kind of set the stage for us and talk about what ambiguous loss is and how it differs from other types of loss? Because I know that's one big part of it is that this type of loss really is different than others.
Yeah.
So if you could start out with that, I think that would be a great segue into today's live chat.
Absolutely. Well, Lakelyn, you set it up very beautifully, talking about the experience of caregivers and recognizing that something is really has been lost, but really not having a name for it. And as we chatted a little earlier, I happened across this kind of accidentally, literally a couple of years ago, in preparation for a presentation. And when I read it, I just a light went off in my mind, and it was like, this is the missing link. We always hear about caregiver burden and stress, but the real culprit, I've come to believe, is really this unique loss and grief that is called ambiguous loss. And it's a way to explain losses that are related to absence and presence. It was identified back in the 70s by a family therapist. Her name is Pauline Boss, and she coined this theory, this term. And an ambiguous loss, to define it, it's a loss that is unclear, it has no resolution, and it has no closure. And it occurs in two situations. One situation is when the body is physically missing, but the family or people that love that person continue to hold on, or that person continues to be present to them because there's no verification of where the body is. But the second type of ambiguous loss is more what we're talking about with dementia, which is when the physical body is physically present, but psychologically the person has changed or absent from how they were at one time. And for caregivers, the grief of that is very confusing, very stressful, and unlike any other type of grief. And Dr. Boss talks about it's probably the hardest type of grief to experience. Really leads to a lot of anxiety, ongoing strain, and confusion in relationships. And it's more than just the loss and grief of that relationship. It affects, she calls it a relational condition as well. It affects family relationships and an overall just confusion of what this really is. So it's important to really understand it because, as you said, it's very different than the grief and loss we experience when someone dies. That we have a template to do that, but we don't know how to do this type of loss. So when we can understand it and learn about it, it can help us become a little bit more comfortable living with the uncertainty of dementia. And it can really provide a new lens, give us a new way of relating to the person with dementia. What I love about it is I've found it to be really helpful. The one thing that was so difficult to work with before even having this concept is that people were constantly just longing for the person that used to be there that has now been changed. And that's just no longer a realistic hope. And so ambiguous loss gives us kind of a way to change the lens of that, to change how we see this. And I wanted to share with you kind of the basic premise of ambiguous loss, which is when a loved one is lost only partially, the ambiguity coupled with the loss creates a powerful barrier to both coping and grieving. And I just find that such a powerful statement because it really addresses how we often see caregivers are almost kind of immobilized. They don't know what action to take, which direction to go, so afraid, so fearful that it's not right, that it does. They do become immobilized. And she refers to that sometimes as frozen grief. So it just really, it's really helpful to have a name for it. So I just want to briefly just go through a few of the strategies or kind of ways of approaching this. And the first one is having a name for it. as I mentioned, I just kind of happened across it, and at that presentation, I brought it up, and it was very interesting. The audience literally kind of sat up straighter and, looked very interested and responded immediately. And so when I came back to the office, and I meet with caregivers most every day, and presented this as they were telling me their situation, people would start crying. And it was like, oh my goodness, this is really resonating. This does make sense to have a name for it, helping people feel like they're not crazy. It's the situation that's crazy, that they're not the ones that's crazy. So having a name is powerful in and of itself. And then the other skill that she really utilizes a lot is what she calls paradoxical thinking. It's both and thinking instead of either or. And the whole purpose of it is for us to be, when you think about ambiguity, it's like kind of living in the fog, becoming more comfortable living with uncertainty. And both and thinking helps us take two ideas, both of which are true and are true at the same time. But that's very different than normally what we more think of either or. It's either this or it's that. It's not both and. So a very simplistic example of dual thinking or paradoxical thinking is something like, both my mother needs to be cared for and I need to take care of myself. But sometimes an easier way to have people get used to this approach is to think about filling in the sentence, something like, due to my caregiving experience, I have lost blank and I have gained blank. And in doing that with the program that we have here called Steps to Hope, there have just been some amazing thoughts that have come from that. And one that I want to share with you is a daughter who promised her dad before he passed away that she would care for her mother. And in thinking about this paradoxical thinking, she came up with the thought of, I have both lost my mom and I have gained the trust of my dad. And that leads us to one of her guidelines, which is finding meaning, of helping one find meaning in this experience is very important. Another principle she talks about is good enough is good enough. That many caregivers, like most of us, we want to do our very best possible job, and sometimes that means doing it a certain way, perfect way, and that's just not possible with caregiving due to the multiple changes, the uncertainty, the unpredictability. So there's really a saying that is pervasive, which is good enough is good enough. We learn that less than perfect solutions really aren't the way to go because it's not possible. In her book, and I want to recognize the book, Loving Someone Who Has Dementia. She's written many, but this is the one specifically that we're talking about. She reviews 7 guidelines, and I just briefly want to touch on those if that will be helpful, and then I'm anxious to hear your questions. But these are not a to-do list. This is not a to-do list. These are questions for you to reflect on, and she explains that not all of them are going to be as important to you at any one time. You focus on the ones that are meaningful at the time. But the first guideline is to find meaning in what you're doing. And that's pretty hard to do when everything you thought you knew about this person in your relationship has changed. And that can be overwhelming to folks. And Viktor Frankl, in his book about Man's Search for Meaning, really addressed this well when he connected finding meaning to hope, that there's no hope without meaning and no meaning without hope. And losses in dementia, they don't make sense. They're nonsensical. And Dr. Paz says, sometimes that's as good as it is. That may be the meaning. But as people reflect on this, they come up, just with that, like the saying that I gave you, the paradoxical thought, this caregiver really found meaning in that was important to her, that she had not had the trust of her father, and now this had provided a vehicle to have that. So it's important to find meaning in it, and understanding that, some questions don't have answers and some problems don't have solutions. But that's okay, and that's kind of what dementia is about. The second guideline has to do with balancing control with acceptance. And that's a hard one for us in this society because we really value mastery. And this is something we're not going to be able to master. But we can, we make a conscious choice to master what we can. And the things we can control are we can master our thoughts, our reactions, and our internal selves. You know, some people realize that they can't fix this, but they can attend to their own health. Maybe they decide to get into an exercise program. They can decide to also nourish themselves, enjoy themselves, and be a caregiver. So it's balancing that control with acceptance of what's going on. The third guideline is about broadening your identity, or really revising your identity to fit the ambiguity of the situation. Your role, it can become very confused. You know, caregiver daughters might say, am I still the daughter if I'm really being the parent? Or am I still married if my husband doesn't know who I am? Those roles can become confused. And we realize that we can be both. It's also, that's where that both and thinking comes into play. The fourth guideline is about managing your mixed emotions. And she really focuses on ambivalence, which is two challenging thoughts at the same time, two conflicting emotions at the same time, love and hate. I want this to be over, and then feeling horribly guilty because that means that person wouldn't be here anymore. This is where also I think guilt comes in. I've just never met a caregiver that hasn't felt guilt about something, whether they've done everything right or not. And so it's important to learn to manage these emotions and to recognize those are normal, and understanding, being with other caregivers, being able to have a voice to that, sharing those emotions. It's understandable to have them, but we certainly don't want to act on them. And so it's important to be able to have friends, support groups, or professionals to talk about those feelings if necessary and when necessary. The fifth one is about restructuring your attachments, and she calls it hold on and let go. That we don't want to let go of the attachment, but with dementia, the relationship becomes so one-sided that it's important that we have other people that are present with us, because this relationship can no longer provide that for us in the same way. So it's holding on to the relationship, appreciating that, being present with that, but at the same time, recognizing the importance of having people that you can be present with and can nourish you in the way that that relationship no longer can. I remember the first time we did a group on this, one woman just blurted out in the middle of talking about this guideline, you mean it's okay to go out with my friends? And it's like, not only is it okay, it's really important to do that. Mm-hmm. So that's helpful for folks, I think. And then the last one, which is, number 6 is imagine new hopes and dreams. Along with being a caregiver, you know, when you talk about taking care of yourself or what are you doing for yourself, caregivers, their eyes roll back in their head. It's like, are you kidding? I don't have time for anything. But it is really important to have time to think about what you can do to nourish yourself while you're providing care, and what is it going to be like in the future? And is there anything you can do now kind of toward that? And a wonderful example from one of a woman that was in the group talked about how she had always wanted to play the piano. Her children had taken the piano. They had a beautiful piano, but she just had never had the time or thought it made sense for her to do it. And now she was home a lot. She was with her husband, and it was getting harder and harder for him to get out of the home. And one day she received a postcard in the mail that there was a piano teacher in her neighborhood who was teaching piano lessons to adults. And a light bulb went off. She took some lessons, and by the time she came to the group, she had taken 3 lessons. She had learned 3 songs, and now every night she and her husband would join her, and she'd play the piano for him with those 3 songs. And that was meeting a personal goal that was very meaningful and helpful while she was providing care. And then the last guideline, of course, is to take time to mind yourself. That is what self-care is about. And it's really not a luxury. It's really important to balance that along the way. So I have a quote. I'm going to hold this off till the end. She sums it up very well, but maybe we'll talk about this at the end. So I hope that's been helpful to kind of lay some groundwork for this.
Wow, Susy, that was wonderful. Here I said, oh, don't worry about taking notes because we're recording this, and I'm here scribbling all sorts of notes myself on all of those 7 guidelines. And I think there was really 2 things that really stood out to me, and that I think it's so important for caregivers to consider is that the phrase, I have lost blank, but I have gained blank. I think it's so easy for caregivers to get caught up in what they've lost. Maybe not only their loved one is fading away, but maybe they've also had to give up, some of their personal ambitions or their travels. But there is so much to be gained through caregiving. And I also hear beautiful stories of how they've really, it's been the hardest thing they've ever done, but the most rewarding. So I think to focus on that hope is so important.
And that's what this does. And it just wasn't in our conversation. It wasn't in my conversation before this. I mean, all I could do is feel bad or feel sorry and listen empathetically, but then didn't have anything to say, well, what about? But now it's like she says, it's a new lens. It's a whole new way of looking at it. It doesn't fix it, but it lets us control what we can control, and that's all we have here. It's the only window of hope anymore, is to change our perceptions about this.
Most certainly. And then the one other thing before we dive into question is the good enough is good enough.
Yeah.
I think that's another, caregivers are so hard on themselves and want to do everything perfectly. And they just have to accept that you're right, that this disease doesn't make any sense. And so you can't do anything perfectly. And so we just need to be mindful that you are doing good. You are doing the best you can with the circumstances you've been given. So those were some good takeaways. And then I probably have 4 or 5 from every single strategy that you offered up. But I mean, you did an entire hour-long webinar on this, so I know we could go on and on, but I do want to make sure we get to people's questions. And so we do have a few that have come in, but if you're listening and if you have a question for Susy, we encourage you to type it in. There's a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can type in a question at any time. And if you don't really have a question, but more so just want to tell Susy about your situation, feel free to do that too. Maybe there's some advice that she can offer up to you. But we're going to start with Iris's question. So are you ready, Susy, for a couple questions?
Yep.
All right. So Iris, here we go. So Iris says, can you share some advice for the repeated grief response to continual decline of persons with Alzheimer's disease? Our family has been on the memory impairment journey for almost 10 years now. Each new stage of decline brings on another grief process. I'm emotionally tired. Oh, my heart goes out to Iris.
Yeah, that's a really, it's a common question and a really important question. And Iris, what this does is Dr. Boss talks about the importance of grieving along the way. That's what is one of the things that's so unique about this loss. Unlike when someone dies. I mean, it is hard and it's sad, but we know what the template is, what it's going to look like. And we don't know in this because we don't know when it's going to end, how it's going to end, how long it's going to go. But along the way, we are seeing losses most every day of some sort. And so her suggestion, kind of what she teaches us, is to mark those losses. And it's like, well, how do you do that? And you think about, well, there are a lot of different ways. You think about family and friend rituals, gatherings or celebrations that we have. And a lot of them are like when people are born or when people get married. I mean, it's kind of new beginnings, but we also have some in terms of funerals or wakes, and it's creating some new ones where we can celebrate both the, well, not celebrate, but acknowledge both the losses, celebrate the past, recognize where we are now, and even some of the losses along the way. But it's very, her real teaching here is that it's important to do with at least one other person, that's what makes it real, and that's what can be most comforting. So I'll give you an example of a woman. So we do groups here. We do 5-week groups, and then we have a monthly kind of booster group or support group. And in one of these booster groups, so all the people that come to this have gone through that series, and so there's sometimes different people within the group, not necessarily the same group each month. A young woman came in, and she was beside herself, and she just said, I have to tell people something. She went on for about 5 minutes without stop about how frustrated, how angry, how just depleted she was. The group was totally silent, and she was very angry, and the anger was coming out at her husband who had dementia, and it was directed at him. And she literally kind of went on until she was just spent. She was done. And everybody was kind of silent. And I looked around the group, and suddenly a man just very gently said, "Thank you. You have shared what I have felt, but I didn't know that it was okay to share it with other people." And that was an important lesson, I think, for all of us of how important it is to share these losses and these changes with others. And then feel and know that they get it in ways that other people can't.
Wow.
So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I'm sure it is very helpful for Iris, and I think that you made a good point of you grieve along the way as these individuals are experiencing further and further decline.
I have another time. I saw Dr. Boss on a video one time, and somebody asked her about this, and she said, "It doesn't matter what you do. Eat a pie." And every time there's a loss, eat a pie, and everybody just started laughing. And it's true. It's just, but it is being aware of it, recognizing it, and that's a lot of it is being present within this, and that's important to be present about the losses as well.
Well, and we this next question actually ties in really nicely to what you had just shared with us. Elizabeth just wrote in and she said, "Are there support groups?" She seems to be in the Phoenix Chandler area that are based on the concept of ambiguous loss. But I'm wondering, Susy, would you kind of speak to support groups and where people could look to in their local communities to find this support? Because it sounds like surrounding yourself with people who are going through similar situations can be so helpful. I know, there's these online kind of chats and maybe some online support groups that exist, but can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, certainly the Alzheimer's Association, I mean, that would be a place to certainly check about support groups because they have extensive listings. Regarding specific ones for ambiguous loss, I know, well, to answer that question from the person in the Phoenix area, there are, well, we do not so much a support group here, we do a therapy group called Steps to Hope. But there's also the Duet organization has a video series of Dr. Boss, and you can contact Duet for that person that's in Phoenix area. But for others that aren't in this area, and I don't have other resources around the country regarding this, but this book, this Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, it is so versatile in terms of how it can be used. And if you are in a support group or you find a support group, you might suggest that people take a look at that. And there, at the end of each chapter, there are actually discussion and reflection questions that are very, I mean, this is the content right here. And it can be discussed informally as well as a class or a video or anything else. So I really highly recommend that you do that, or even not even a formalized group. If you have friends, if there are other caregivers in your social support network, get together to take a look at that.
That's a great suggestion. I'm going to hop online and order that book after this live chat wraps up, because it sounds like such a great resource. So I know earlier sorry,
no,
I interrupted
go ahead.
you there. I know earlier you had mentioned seeking out therapy or counseling too as an option for those that might also need that. So if they don't have a support group in their area, maybe that's another option or outlet for them as well. Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we have another question from Dana. She says, I am a caregiver. My husband was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at 56 years old. We are both now 59. My husband is now in an assisted living facility. I'm having a very hard time visiting him. Can you speak to that? Of course, I love my husband and miss him terribly, and seeing him this way just kills me. It's not him. I do visit, but I don't want to. So is there any way, any advice that you have for Dana and others that are having this sort of an experience?
Yeah, and that makes me sad, and I'm sad for both of you. And Dana, I guess the one thing I would ask is, this really addresses that guideline about hold on and let go, to recognize that he is not going to be who he was before this happened. That just can't be. But along with that, and not but, instead of but, and are there any traits, or are there any kind of personalities or traits or behaviors that he has now that bring you any kind of joy or pleasure? And why I ask that, I talk best, I think, in stories, and stories from what I learned from other people. And I'm thinking of a couple that I met, and it was the first time I had met them. He was in the moderate stage of dementia, and his wife was just incredibly in tune to him and sweet with him. And we were talking, and he would get a little bit confused. And when he would, come into the conversation and it was a little bit off track, she would just kind of pat his hand and give him eye contact and, nod her head. She validated that, yes, we hear you, and then we would go on. And he had to leave. He had to use the restroom, and he left, and I looked at her and said, how do you do that? It came so naturally to her. And she said, I recognized years ago when he was diagnosed with this, that he wasn't going to be the man he had been before. He had been a very high-powered businessman, not a lot of time for the family, not a lot of time for acknowledgement of her. But in this disease process, he had become very appreciative and thanked her often for everything she did. And she now recognized that he wasn't the same, but the attachment was still there. She was seeing parts of him that she could not access before his dementia. So that doesn't always happen, but if we look at that or consider that, if that can help kind of reinforce that attachment that we have. But also, Dana, to know that it is all right, and it's important for you to have relationships with other people as well, and that can be present with you and can engage with you in a way that he may no longer be able to.
Those are some great suggestions, Susie. And I know this is visiting someone in a facility setting, or going to visit a loved one that has Alzheimer's and dementia. It's such a common topic that we get asked about a lot. And I don't mean to jump ahead at all, but just at the end of today, we're going to talk about next month's topic, and that's actually the topic for next month. So Dana, I hope you tune back in for to talk more about that, because it can be hard to know, what to do when you go to visit.
How to spend that
not
time.
Quite the same. Yeah. So those are some great suggestions, and we're going to dive even deeper into that topic next month. But thank you so much. Again, going back to that not and or, but the way that you described
either or.
Either or.
Not either or, but both and.
Yeah, both and. Perfect. And then we had Amanda just write in, and she said, how can the caregiver get others, meaning family and friends, to understand this ambiguous loss and to deal with the guilt-ridden criticisms on how they're dealing with their emotions? That's kind of a tough question, but Amanda, thanks for writing in. I know others have that same question. So hopefully, Susie, do you have any suggestions for Amanda?
So, yeah, I had mentioned briefly how Dr. Boss talks about this as a relational condition as well.
Mm-hmm.
And, our hope, our wish is that our family back us up, kind of have our back and don't disagree or see it in the same way. And sometimes that just doesn't happen. And sometimes it's just the opposite of what happens. One suggestion she makes is you don't waste time on the slackers. If you're the primary caregiver and there's a lot of disagreement, you know what? It might be time to find a psychological family, a group of people, and they can come from anywhere. They can come from your neighbor or someone at church, a good friend, someone who's been through it themselves. And because you only have so much time and energy that you can address this. And get rid of my buts as well. And people have found this, though, once they understand ambiguous loss, that they have shared this with family and friends. Because what it does, too, it helps kind of educate people, but then they're talking on a level playing field, I guess, and may be able to open up the conversation in a way that couldn't be, opened up before. Because there's not right or wrong. Everybody's just doing the best they can.
Mm-hmm. Those are some great suggestions, Susy, and sharing this concept with family members could certainly be a great way to open up the conversation. People could forward this here chat on to their family members just to give them some information. Or I liked how you suggested if you have the book, there's those discussion questions at the end.
Yep.
Maybe there is, two sisters who are working together to care for mom, and they read this book together and then chat about it. Or that could be another great resource. So
it is. It's really versatile. It just can be used in so many ways.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I can't wait. I can't wait to order that book. So Amanda, I hope that those suggestions were helpful, and thank you so much for writing in your questions. Please continue to send in your questions. We're happy to answer them. Just type them in at any time in the chat box. We'll get to as many of them as we can throughout this hour. We still have some time left. So if you have a question that you're holding on to, please don't hesitate. We'd love to hear from you. But we do have a question from Debbie. She says, I'm trying to get used to the fact that my mom forgets the fun things we did and the places we went and so many other things. And I'm afraid she is going to forget me someday.
Oh, yeah.
Can you offer up any advice?
So, Debbie, I guess I first would, I'm not sure about this, but sometimes the longest memories, long ago memories, are the most accessible to the person with dementia, depending where they are in that stage. So if the things that she's forgetting are the things that you've done most recently, I'm wondering if you can go back in your memory as well and think about maybe when you were a bit younger and remind her of things that were so meaningful to her that she could connect with. That's one thought I had about that, or using pictures from the past as a way of kind of bringing up those memories and engaging with that. I don't know if that would be helpful. Lakelyn, do you have other thoughts on that idea as well?
Yeah, I think that those are certainly some really great suggestions. Yeah, drawing on those long-term memories can be good, and sometimes just sharing those pictures, talking about the memories, and making new
or maybe
memories
what
together.
She's learned. Yeah, making new memories together. Absolutely. Or what the daughter has learned, what she's appreciated so much about her mom, what her mom taught her.
Most certainly.
But I also, the thing about, is she going to forget me? I mean, that's what breaks my heart. And it reminds me years ago when I was working up in Seattle, there was a woman who had dementia, and we had I had been working with her for a while. And later on in the process, she would look at me and say, I don't know your name, but I know I like you. And that was just so important for me to understand that even if the name recognition isn't there, there's still this, core, this sense of being cared about. And that's I'm sure that's what Debbie wants to maintain.
Most certainly, yes. I know I've heard many different experts in the field talk about, even if they don't remember your name,
Yeah.
they'll always remember how you make them feel. So
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
a lot of times they'll know that they know you somehow, or they know that you provide a sense of security and safety to them in some way. So, Debbie, we know that that is such a hard fear to have, and then hopefully you never have to experience it. But if you do someday, hang on to the fact that she'll always remember how you made her feel. So continue to provide that comfort and security to her, like you're doing today. So thank you, Susy. Those are good suggestions. And Debbie, we wish you the best and hope that your mom hangs on to her memories of you for as long as possible. And then we have another comment that came in from Anita. She says, I'm depressed that my mom will pass away. She has had Alzheimer's for over 16 years and I will miss her. So she didn't ask a specific question per se, but any words of encouragement for Anita as she's coping with this thought? It's amazing to me that someone living with Alzheimer's disease or dementia could live for, as little as a couple of years all the way up to 16 plus years. That's a long time to be caring for someone. So any advice for her?
I don't know that I have any advice. I just really believe that the cost of loving someone is being sad when they die. And it's worth it. I mean, she will miss her. But while she's here, I think she has the opportunity to let her mom know that in any way that her mom can understand that. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be verbal communication, but by being with her, just how she even phrased the question, it's clear that her mom's got to know how much she is going to be missed and loved. And that's healing for her mom as well.
Most certainly. And Susy, as you were going through those kind of 7 principles from Dr. Voss's book, you had talked about number 6 and 7, imagining new hopes and dreams and taking time for yourself and self-care. It sounds like if Anita already hasn't taken time to think about those things, that might be also a way.
Time.
Yeah, a good time.
And sharing that with her mom. And again, I don't know, where her mom is, how much she can share verbally, but just having her mom be part of that as she contemplates that she spent 16 years caring for her mom. What would her mom want her to do? What had they talked about previously? How would that look? I think that's a great idea, Lakelyn.
Well, and I talk to so many caregivers, and I know you do too, Susy, and oftentimes they'll say, well, I know my mom or my husband or my father would want me, move on eventually and, find my passions again and rededicate all my time to my family or my career or my hobbies. So I think that you bring up a great point. Think through, Anita, what would your mom want you to do once she passes on?
And don't we do that? I know I do that. My mom passed away about 7 years ago, and there's sometimes I feel like I channel her when I'm not sure what would she be telling me right now. And that's comforting. That's comforting to me.
Most certainly. And we do have another question that came in, and this one is slightly off topic, but I think it's one that it's a common situation. So Yoli wrote in and said that this person's mom was diagnosed 3 years ago and had to place her in an assisted living facility because she lived home alone and they're far away. So I know long distance caregiving is very common for many people. But her question is, she says, I had to, sorry, I'm going to paraphrase. This is a little bit long. She keeps talking about going back home constantly, which breaks her heart.
The mom keeps talking about going back home.
Yes. So she's in this community and she's asking to go home, or when will I get to go home? So she's asking, do I just go along with this and tell her, we'll go back home someday, or do I tell her the truth? And she says, I feel like she's been through a lot already. I don't want to make her more upset or anxious.
Right.
So any thoughts or suggestions for Yoli in this situation?
Yeah. So sometimes that whole issue of going home really isn't about going home. I've had caregivers sometimes, a husband come in and say, my wife's wanted to go home, and I took out the document that this is our home. We own our home. And it's like, I don't think that's what she's asking. Because when we think about home is kind of a metaphor sometimes for when things were good, when I was healthy, when it was safety. And so sometimes by even changing the conversation or asking a question about not focusing on going back home, because it might not even be that home she's talking about. But it sounds like you missed home. Tell me about home. What do you miss most about it? What was it like there? And then just getting off on that, you're just changing the dialogue, if you will, to a whole nother topic related, but not about going home. And she's right, by telling her that there's no kind reason to do that. It would more than likely just make her sad if you say, no, we can't go. So you want to change the scenario, change the topic if you can, and be interested. And it may lead to a lot of different things that Julie hadn't thought about before or known about before.
Those are some great suggestions. Yeah, that question of wanting to return home seems to be a very common one that comes up often among family caregivers and their care recipients, their loved ones. So thank you for those suggestions, and I'm sure Yoli will really appreciate those suggestions. And we did have another question that came in from April, and she says, the times I've tried to talk about my losses in my husband's dementia journey with close family and friends, it seems like they've started to distance themselves from me. This illness consumes my life, and it seems that people want to hear the positives. Why are they trying to keep me from expressing my grief? Everything in life is not full of roses. Oh, our heart goes out to you, April, and thank you for sharing your experience with us. Any thoughts for her, Susy?
Yeah, April, and so many other caregivers have that same feeling, and that's what makes caregivers feel so isolated and alone, because people that aren't living with this can't get it. They can't get it in the same way that people that are. So first thing is I hope you find, I wish for you to find a group or to find a few people that are experiencing this or have experienced it, so you can be open about even the sadness of this. But April, too, if you think about just simply explaining this concept to your family, and how if it touches you, if it makes sense to you, and it helps you, that you want to share this with them so they can kind of understand it more, because there is a disconnect, and I think this ambiguous loss, one, it gives a name to it, and it provides a bridge, I think, for us to meet halfway, for them to maybe have a little bit more understanding of what they didn't. For example, something very simple that, when maybe they see her husband, April, when they see your husband, he's at his very best, and they say, what are you talking about? He seems to be just fine. But they don't see that after they go home, he just might be exhausted or confused, and it takes a toll. And so they don't have a clear picture. But you might maybe share with them that, gee, you heard this chat, and you want to share this with them. What are their thoughts, or you found it to be helpful for, and see what they say.
Yes, those are some great points. And finding that support, I feel like that is something that just a recurring theme in this last hour is finding others to connect with. And we're all glad that you tune into these chats, because this is a way to connect with other caregivers. And while it might just be, over the phone or over your computer, sharing your experiences, I find, always helps at least one other caregiver. And that's so powerful. So finding a community, whether it's a support group at your local healthcare organization like Banner in the Phoenix area, or through the Alzheimer's Association, or there's online chat groups for people who are in more rural communities. That can be so powerful for someone going through this experience. It removes that isolation factor. Sometimes caregivers feel so isolated. And I think as you're going through these, guidelines, the suggestion of making sure that you're finding others to be present with and to interact with besides just the care recipient, if at all possible, is so important. Just for your mental health, your emotional health, and taking care of yourself, taking care of your physical health. So all great suggestions, Susy. Thank you. And as we head into the last 10 minutes or so of our chat, we still have time for a couple questions, so feel free to type in any last questions you have for us. But I wanted to move to the resource slide because we do have some resources that we would like to share with you. If you want to learn more about Susy's organization, you can visit the Banner website. And then the healthforalzheimersfamilies.com is where we will post the recording of this webinar. And also caregiverstress.com is another great website that covers all things stress related when it comes to caregiving, not just specific to Alzheimer's or dementia. And then we have a great Facebook community, and if you're not already a member of our Facebook community, we have it right there, remember, for Alzheimer's families. And then finally, Confidence to Care. There's a great book and app out there. The app is free to download on tips and advice for caring for a loved one with Alzheimer's and dementia. And then, Susy, I just wanted to ask you one more time, would you repeat the book, the title of the book that Dr. Boss wrote?
Yes. It's called Loving Someone Who Has Dementia.
Okay. And it's by Pauline Boss, is that right?
Yep. And it's Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, How to Find Hope While Coping with Stress and Grief.
Wow, that sounds like such a great book. So that could be also a good one to look into. Check into your library to see if they have it. I'm sure it's downloadable, or maybe downloadable on your Kindle, or you can order on Amazon, I'm sure.
Amazon, yep.
Perfect. Well, as we enter into these last couple of minutes of our chat, Susy, I just wanted to check in with you, see if there is any last kind of words of wisdom or advice, any closing kind of thoughts that you have around this topic of ambiguous loss.
Well, my own thoughts, I hope everyone will give the book a look. I think maybe not all of it will grab you, but I think there'll be some pearls in it that will be very meaningful and helpful. But I had said I had some words of wisdom that aren't mine. They're from Pauline Boss. So I think this is a good time to share that. And it has to do, like when you had talked about a good enough relationship, this is a quote from her that I love. She says, quote, "When you love someone with dementia, the goal is not perfection. The new standard for your relationship is simply for it to be good enough. Life with dementia can be less than ideal and still pretty good. That perceptual shift is under your control." Now, isn't she just like who you want to grow up to be?
Yes. Wow, that is such a powerful quote. And is that part of her book? Is that where that comes from? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that as caregivers, you had mentioned this earlier, and then she beautifully illustrates it in that quote. But sometimes you just kind of have to recalibrate your expectations for yourself and your relationship, and focus on the good and doing your best. That's so
doing
important.
Your best. That's all we can do. And what is very cool about this, Lakelyn, too, is that caregivers literally, once they experience this and live it in their day-to-day life, so many of them come back. We have these monthly support groups, and they come back and say, I'm just better at going with the flow. And they are proud. It really is. It's like it's a success that maybe they've been very kind of goal-directed and everything had to be in place. And this is a new way of life at their age, and that's resilience. This makes them stronger and makes them better equipped to deal with challenges we're going to face as we all get older. So it's really kind of a win-win, and it can be kind of a maybe a fearful thought to begin this process, but people come out on the other end feeling very proud of themselves and come up with all kinds of slogans like, I plan my day, but when it doesn't go right, I just let it go. And laugh about it and find some fun in that, where before it would have driven them crazy. So they see change in themselves as well, which is fabulous.
That's wonderful. Yeah, you had mentioned earlier balancing control with acceptance, and that's something that is, I think, important for caregivers to come to the realization of, is they may not be able to control everything in their circumstance. They can't control this disease. They can't control what the person can remember and what they can't. So they just need to find that acceptance, and that newfound acceptance, I think, leads to freedom in some regard.
It does.
Lets them
and allow yourself to enjoy the idiosyncrasies that just come to play now.
Yeah, most certainly. I think you had mentioned how sometimes we just also need to find the humor or the positive in this situation, because it can be, we talk about how it's so hard and difficult and challenging, but there's so much good and reward that can come out of caregiving for a loved one. And I think it's so easy for family caregivers to forget that there are positives. It's not, as April had mentioned, it's not all roses and sunshine. We certainly know that. But I think that it is possible to find little rays of light or rays of hope in each and every day.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and April just wrote back. She says, I continue to calling this living a new normal. And I think that sums it up perfectly, April. Wonderful.
Yep.
Well, and I know I mentioned a little earlier that I would share next month's live chat information, so we'll get that pulled up here on the screen for you. Next month, we have an expert, Jennifer Fitzpatrick. She's the author of a book, and she'll be talking about tips for socializing with someone who has dementia. So we invite you to join us again on April 18th for that live chat. It'll be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And then again, we'll be talking about socializing with someone with dementia, even throughout the different stages. So we'll talk about the early stages when they still can interact, and even in those later stages when they might not have the words to speak anymore, and how we can still be present with that person. So again, thank you all for joining in today. We hope to talk to you next month. And Susy, I want to thank you for joining us. It has been truly a delight, and I have learned so much from you, and I know that others also have learned a lot through this chat. We're already getting some comments in from various listeners about their appreciation. So thank you, Susy.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was really fun. Thanks to everybody.
All right, everyone. We'll have a wonderful rest of the day, and we hope to hear you back on the line on April 18th. So take good care, and we'll talk to you again soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Goodbye. Oh, I didn't do that. Socialize.